Okay, so if you're like me as an artist, you've probably had a lot of questions about how to photograph your artwork over the years, how to set it up properly, how to achieve the very best image possible on whatever medium or surface you're using to create your art, and then how to edit it once you've captured that image of your painting or drawing. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything I've learned over the past 18 years of imaging, scanning, photographing my artwork, from the proper lighting all the way to editing it in Photoshop if you want some more advanced education in that. So this video is for everyone from a beginner or a hobbyist all the way to the professional artist who wants to get the most out of their camera. Okay, so let's start with the very basics. You need to determine what your intentions are as an artist. Are you the artist that wants to produce art as a hobby, but you want to document those paintings in the form of photos to share with friends and family in the future? Or are you an artist that wants to become a professional someday? That's very important, because if you want to become a professional selling prints and originals, you should not start out with a consumer grade point and shoot camera, a cheap thing under $100 like this. You're going to want to start out by producing the best quality images of your work from the very start. It may not seem important just yet, but it will be in the future. So get the very best photos possible. You're going to want to start out with a very entry-level DSLR if you can afford it, or step up into a more expensive camera. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if you're just the hobbyist and you want to just simply take the best quality photos you can of your art, this will probably work for you. It's just a simple, cheap point and shoot camera, and what you're going to want to do is make sure that your lighting comes from the side, and you could go outside, you could use the sun. Make sure the sun is coming downwards at your painting, not from behind. If it comes from behind, we're going to get reflection of that light back into the camera, and it's going to create a very poor quality image. But if you're inside, what I do is I just take desk lamps. You could use 2 desk lamps, maybe 3, 1 from above, 2 from each side, and then you're going to want to put them at a very steep angle so they're just enough to cut into your painting to give it light, and then stand back at least a few feet with your camera and make sure you're using a tripod so it's not shaky, and simply take a picture of your art, and there you go. You're going to have a quality photograph pretty much no matter what. You're not going to want to use a white room. I recommend using maybe a darker room. I've got a lot of black fabric in my studio, and that helps cut down the reflection a lot. So that's all you pretty much need to know if you're a hobbyist. Now, you could take that photo and drop it into a program like Photoshop, or there might be even some free programs now that come with your computer that you can crop out maybe the background, maybe the photo had some picture of the grass behind or the house or the wall behind, and you could just crop that out simply with a program. So that's pretty much all you need to know if you're the hobbyist. So before I talk about more advanced camera equipment, what if I only create drawings? What if I only draw on paper or paint on paper? Or maybe what if I only paint on hardboard? What if the surface I use is perfectly smooth and my paintings are perfectly smooth when finished? Can I scan those? Well, the answer is yes, but there's very few scanners out there that have the capabilities to produce images that are of quality, the equivalent quality as a nice SLR camera, and also a very few amount of scanners are able to produce images that you can print very well for reproductions. The scanner that I've used and owned in the past was the Epson Expression 11000 XL. It's a very expensive scanner. They run from $2,000 to $3,000 typically, but they produce the utmost highest quality images. They work great for drawings. They work great for paintings that are painted on a hardboard and that you don't paint. Also, you got to make sure you don't paint too thick. If you paint with a lot of texture, impasto-like stuff, that's also not going to work. And even my fine woven canvases that I use to paint my larger works, even though they're very smooth, that little bit of texture in the canvas just won't work on a scanner, because the way a scanner works is when the light element runs across your painting, it's only coming from one angle. And so as that's coming across, the texture in whatever surface you're using is going to be shaded on one side and illuminated on the other. It doesn't have light coming from both angles like we can use in photography. So scanners do work well for drawings and smooth surfaces, but be careful if you ever paint with any amount of texture or use surfaces like canvas, you will not get a good image by using a scanner. So scanners, if you're really sold on drawing and you know that you're never going to paint in the future, you can probably get away with a scanner. Okay, so let's talk about the artist who wants to become a professional, or perhaps the artist who is already a professional but wants to really get into photographing their artwork themselves and producing the best quality images they can. You could either go with an expensive SLR camera or you could go with a consumer grade SLR camera. We're talking about $3,000 setup versus a $300 setup. Now, if you're an artist just starting out, or even if you're a professional, there are ways to make a consumer grade SLR camera work for you. Now, important things to remember is of course the lens. We'll talk about the lens in a minute, but also you want to make sure that you are fairly competent on how to use the manual settings on your camera, and I'll show you why right now. Now, every time you take a photograph with your SLR camera, we can preview it using the playback screen. And on most brands of cameras, we can use the navigator and hit that down twice. At least that's how Nikon works, and we can pull up the histogram on the playback screen right on the camera. Now, you're gonna wanna know how to understand that histogram and how to manipulate it so that you can take the best possible photographs. Let me show you real quick what a histogram is and why it's important. Okay, now before we get into the histogram itself, let's talk about the settings that we're going to be concerned about when using our camera on manual mode. We have ISO, we have f-stop or our aperture, and then we have our shutter speed. Now, these are the three main settings that you really need to be worried about. You don't need to go far beyond that. We have other settings on our camera such as white balance. I keep most of those on auto. Occasionally you might have to tweak them, but it all depends on the camera itself. Some cameras do well on auto, others not so much. So that's something you might have to experiment with your own. But these are the three settings that you're mostly going to be concerned about. So ISO. In general, you want to keep your camera at the lowest setting possible, which would be 100 for most cameras. Occasionally I'll go up to 800, but that's fairly rare. I usually don't go up over 640. So I should say that a camera such as an entry-level or consumer grade SLR, which would be like the 3100 from Nikon, is not going to be able to go in that 400 to 800 range. Once we get into that range, this camera is going to produce noise and graininess in your photo. It's going to decrease the quality. 400 to 800, I would only recommend for a high-end or professional grade SLR, and even then, some cameras aren't very good at going over 400. So it depends on your camera. In general, keep it as low as you can. Now, f-stop, I generally go with a 7.1 or higher. Sometimes I start with a 5.6, but the reason we don't want to go lower is the lower we go, the shorter our range of focus becomes, the narrower our range of focus becomes. And if we have a small field of focus, and our painting, maybe we've got texture on our painting, or maybe our painting is on a hardboard and it kind of bows out towards the edges. Those edges might be blurry, some of that texture might be blurry. So we want a wide range of focus in our photograph so that everything is crystal clear. So I go with at least a 5.6, sometimes a 7.1, and occasionally I'll go up to 11. I usually don't go higher. Start at 5.6 and see how that goes. Sometimes start at 7.1. Just gonna have to play with it as well. Now our shutter speed, that really depends on the painting itself. We're gonna always be adjusting our shutter speed. Once we have these kind of set in stone, once you have a good feel for your camera of what you need to be setting your camera at off the bat when it comes to ISO and f-stop, shutter speed will just depend on the painting after that. So let's get into the histogram itself. Let's assume that we have a painting that has a pure white and a pure black. Now, this is important because this is going to dictate how our histogram is going to look. On our right side of our histogram, we have our light values, and the left side of the histogram, we have our dark values. And this is basically the data that is contained within our photo. Our light our lights and our darks and all that data in between for our mid values. So let's say we take a photograph and the first photograph comes out like this. What this means is there is a whole lot of data in your photograph on the dark values and there's absolutely no data on your light values. What this means is that your photograph is underexposed because we know that we should have data on our pure white. We should have some data in our light values and it's completely non-existent. This means we have underexposed our picture and we need to basically lower our shutter speed. We don't need to adjust this stuff yet. We just need to worry about our shutter speed because we know if we lower our shutter speed, we're going to increase the exposure. So let's say we started out with a shutter speed of maybe 1/100th of a second. So what we're going to want to do is lower that to maybe 1/50th of a second. And let's say our next photograph looks like this. And it ends about right there. Now what this means is that we have a photograph that is more accurate to our painting. It has a better exposure. We've got some data on our mid-range values. We don't have that big spike anymore, and we start to have some data on our light values. But we know we have a pure white, and that should be way up here, and there's still no data on that. So that means that we basically need to lower our shutter speed, slow it down even more. So maybe we go from 1/50th down to 1/10th. And let's say our next photograph looks like this. Now, if you get something like this, what we have is a big spike here right on our light values. We've got some good data coming up from our darks, and then all of a sudden we've got this huge spike at the end, and it actually flattens out up top. Now I'm not going to get too technical with photography terms in this, but if we have a spike with a flat hard edge on top, that means that we've basically overexposed our photo and we have lost data. This data should be represented by some kind of spike and then end somewhere down in the corner here. And if we have a flat edge up top and a big spike on our light range, or maybe it exists on our dark range for an underexposed photo, that means we have lost data completely. We have washed it out. We have overexposed. So 1/10 is going to be too slow of a shutter speed. So we started with 1/50th, we went down to 1/10, then maybe we speed it up to, let's say, 1/30th of a second shutter speed. And let's say our last photo looks just like this. And curves right towards the corner. This is a perfectly exposed photograph. You have an absolutely perfect photograph of your artwork. You've got a little data on that pure white, a little bit of data on that solid black, and everything between just depends on how you've painted your photograph. That means you have a substantial amount of darks that you've painted in your photograph, and you've had a substantial amount of lights that you've painted in your photograph. You've got some mid-tones in your photograph, in your painting. I should say you've got some darks in your painting, your lights in your painting, and you've got some mid-values in your painting. This should be a good photo that you can now take into Photoshop. So basically, to sum it up, all you need to worry about is making sure that you don't have any large spikes on the left, you don't have any large spikes on the right, and you have data throughout the histogram. You want it to come up from the corner and go across and down to the next corner. And that's basically going to give you a quality enough photograph to work with. Now, what if you painted a painting that doesn't have a solid white? Maybe you have some grays, but you don't have that pure white in your painting. Your histogram should look something like that, because we know that there is going to be no data of pure white in our photograph because we didn't paint it. So sometimes it's okay to have no data, but only you have to be conscious of how you've done your painting, and that is only important. That you can only leave that out if you know that you left it out in your painting itself. So that's basically what you need to know about a histogram. Let's move on to actually setting up your camera and using the proper lighting. Okay, so when we're first setting up our camera, the first thing that we're going to have to decide is what lens are we going to use. Now, if you're using a lens with a telephoto zoom, basically a lens that extends and retracts, this is going to give you an average result. It's going to give you a good enough photograph if you're just starting out, but if you really want to get the best quality image as possible, you need to use what I have on here, which is a macro lens. And this macro lens has a fixed zoom, meaning it can't retract and it can't expand. And the reason why we want to have a lens that doesn't retract or expand, and again, only if you really need those high quality photographs, is because with a lens that retracts and extends, we have a component of glass up front and we have a component of glass in the back. And as those two pieces of glass extend further away and stretch and zoom that image closer to us, what it's going to do is distort the edges of our photograph. We're going to have a slight blurriness, especially in the corners, because we have two pieces of round glass, and as we pull them apart, those corners are going to start, it's going to create like a spherical blur on your photograph. And if you've ever noticed, by taking a photograph with a lens like this, with a telephoto, maybe you have a lens that's a 18 to 50 zoom, what you're going to find is that your pictures are not crystal clear. It's all right for landscape photography, but it's not going to be the best for artwork photography. So by using a true macro lens, and of course, if you've got a very, very expensive piece of glass, a very expensive lens, upwards of $5,000, $10,000, you're probably going to be okay with a telephoto. But for most of us, you're going to want a macro lens which has a fixed zoom, and I use a 60 millimeter macro lens. It's about $500 or $600, and that'll work just fine for you. You're going to have the most crystal clear pictures you could possibly imagine. So lens is important. Just keep that in mind. If you're just starting out, this will be okay for you, but remember that as you move further along in your career, you're going to want to upgrade to something that takes perfectly crystal clear photographs, and a true macro lens is what you're going to want. The other thing to remember about your lens is that we have the option to add filters, and you can see as I go across the filter here, it's got a slight hue to it. What this is a polarizing filter. It's a piece of polarized glass, and you can get any size to fit any lens. They're about $30 to $60, but what this will do, a polarized filter will reduce any glare off of your painting. So even if we do our very best to reduce our glare by using a dark room and the proper lighting setup, we're still going to run the risk of light reflecting off of our painting, and this lens will reduce that to a very minimal level and give you the best image results possible. So polarized filter, I highly recommend. Okay, so the next component of our setup is what tripod we're going to use. Now we have two types of tripods. We have one that basically has two axes. We've got a tripod that'll rotate left and right, and then we can tighten it and then rotate it back and forth and then tighten it that way. We also have a tripod that has a ball joint at the top, and we can basically rotate the camera how we please. Now, I prefer the ball joint because what this does is we want to line our camera perfectly square, perpendicular with our painting so that it's really nice and even, it's not distorted at all. We want to be perfectly facing our painting as best as we can. And by having a ball joint, if we have a tripod that only moves left and right and forward, up and down, we're going to basically have to move it back and forth and then rotate it and then back and then rotate it and then twist it and rotate it before you can see that our image is nice and square inside our viewfinder. By using a ball joint tripod, we can set up the tripod pretty close to where we need it to be, and then we can rotate the camera accordingly so that we can square it off real nice and then simply tighten it and we're done. So that's the tripod that I prefer. Okay, now before we take our photograph, let's talk a little bit about having a proper lighting setup. Now, you don't need anything expensive. I use basic clip-on desk lamps with light bulbs from a hardware store. I use 160 watt. I want to make sure they're nice and bright. Now, you can see we've got one up top, we've got another one over to the left, we've got another light back over to the right, and then we've got one kind of coming from down below. Now, what that's going to do for us is provide light from all different angles, and it's going to create a very uniform distribution of light across our painting so that when we take our photograph, it appears uniform how it should be rather than having a shaded edge or an overly exposed highlighted edge. We want at least 3 different angles of light. I use 4 angles. Try to not keep your lighting all from up top or maybe from one side. I like to space them out from various angles. That's going to give you the best image possible. Now, the last thing that you'll see is that these light bulbs are way off to the sides, way up top, and they're from a very steep angle. They're not from behind me. They're not kind of behind me off to the side or kind of from the side. They're way off to the side. And that's going to reduce the glare even more. And you'll see as you move those lights, you're going to see how the glare will appear and then disappear. As it disappears, keep going until you don't see any glare at all. And that's basically all you need to know about getting a good lighting setup, nothing fancy. Just use a simple setup like this and you should be good to go. Now that we're ready for the actual photography part of our process, make sure that your lens is lined up perfectly with your painting. You don't want that lens to be pointed downwards or upwards or side to side. You want to line that up to the best of your judgment and then back up appropriately. And again, use the best of your judgment to make sure that that image is nice and square within your viewfinder. And that's basically it. You're ready to snap a photo and you should be good to go. Now, what if you want to take several photos of your photograph? Maybe you're using a consumer grade SLR camera and it's not a big enough image for you. You want to take multiple images and then stitch them together to make a very large resolution image of your painting. Can you do that? Yes, of course, and I'm going to show you how. Okay, so what I've done here is I've moved my camera close enough to where we're basically taking a picture about halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway. So our picture is going to have a little more than halfway across horizontally. Then we're probably going to have to take 3 pictures going upwards. So we'll have 1 picture, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6. And the way that we want to do this is make sure that our camera is always the same distance away from the actual painting. So I use a tape measure, and what I'm going to do is line up that tape measure, put it across my camera, and I'm going to take a piece of tape and we're going to simply pull that tape measure to where it's just touching the canvas, and then we're going to tape it on to the camera body itself. So now as we move our camera upwards and then across to take all 6 photographs of our painting, we're always going to have the same distance away from the camera to our painting, so we don't have to adjust anything at all when we're actually stitching these photographs together. And the last thing that I wanted to share with you, before I got started here, I backed up, maybe back up to here, and I made sure that I had the entire painting in my viewfinder, and I began to adjust the settings. I took pictures, adjusted the settings so that my histogram was correct. And I want that histogram to be representative of the entire painting, not just this first photograph, which will just be the corner down here. If we adjust the histogram right now to just this part of the painting, we're going to have some problems when we get into a very light portion of the painting. So you want to back up, adjust those settings as you're taking a picture of the entire painting, and then save those settings. Don't touch anything, move in really close, and then start taking your photographs, and you work your way up, around, and back down again. So let's get to it. So one thing I forgot to mention is you want to make sure that you're using a self timer when you're taking these photographs. If you're trying to do it manually, you run the risk of bumping that camera just slightly, which could be enough to make a blurry photograph. And because we're only using a half a second shutter speed, that's a lot of time for that camera to shake. So using a self timer is the best way to taking a photo. All right, now that we have all the photographs we need, I'm ready to drop them in on our computer and begin with the editing. Now, I like to use Photoshop. It's what I'm comfortable with. It's one of the more easier programs when it comes to merging photos together like we're going to do today. So that's what I would recommend when it comes to post-editing your images. So let's get on the computer and I'll show you how that's done. So once we have our SD card in our computer and we've got Photoshop open, I'm going to go up to File and I'm going to scroll down to Automate. And then from Automate, I'm going to click Photo Merge. From Photo Merge, we've got a setting on the right called Layout with some options. We're going to leave it on Auto. Photoshop does a very good job with Auto for Photo Merge. So we're going to leave that on Auto, and we're going to make sure that Blend Images Together is selected, and we're going to leave the others unselected, just not needed for this purpose. We're going to click Browse and find our images on our SD card. And we're going to hold down Control and select all of our images, and then we're going to click OK. All these images will show up. I ended up taking 9, make sure they're all there. From there, we're just going to click OK, and we're going to let it do its magic. Okay, now it's stitched all these images together. We'll zoom in, make sure that looks good. And if we zoom in all the way to 100%, we can see how detailed that really is. And if we check how big our image is, image size, we've got an 11,000 by 9,000 pixel image at 300 dpi. This is going to allow us to print anything we want at any scale we want. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to Select, we're going to select all, and then we're going to Edit, Copy Merged. We're going to go to File, New. This is going to create an image that is automatically as big as we need it. Just click OK, and then Paste. We've got our image, so you can see that there's some distortion on our image. It kind of goes downward right here and then back over inwards down through here. So what we'll do to fix that is go up to Edit, we'll go to Transform, and then from Transform we'll go to Distort. And Distort will grab the corner. There'll be little boxes, one in the middle, and then on the corners. We'll drag that corner up. We'll bring this one down just a little bit if we can. And then we'll take this bottom one down here, drag it out. We'll take the top one, we'll drag it inwards just a little bit. And now, if we click Enter, it's going to do its magic, save it, and we now have a perfectly square image. So then what we're going to do is go over here, click our Select tool. We're going to go up to the corner of our painting. We're going to drag that across our entire piece all the way down to the corners. There's going to be just a little bit of clipping around the edges, but that's okay. We're going to click Copy, and then of course File, New. That's going to create a new image at the right amount of dimensions that we need. We'll click OK, and then of course we'll go to Edit and Paste, and we now have a beautiful image of our painting. We'll zoom in to 100%, and you can see that where Photoshop stitched that together is non-existent. We have a perfect image that could be printed at a very, very large dimension. We zoom back out. Looks absolutely beautiful. So the last thing that I want to do is you can see we might have some color correcting to do. There appears to be some more blues down in these neutral shadows. So what we can do to start to fix that is go up to Image, Adjustments, and then scroll down to Selective Color. And And what we can do from there is go to our cyans, because of course this appears blue. We want to get rid of some of those blues. I use no blue in my painting. So we can just drag that cyan. We've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Our cyan is going to be our blue. We can just lower that all the way down. And now that starts to appear a little bit more magenta. So we're going to take the magenta scale and pull that down as well. And then we're going to go up to our drop-down menu. We're going to click blues. We're going to do the same thing. Lower the cyans, lower the magentas. And you can see that really starts to neutralize that blue. Our paintings begin to become more accurate. It's just going to take some time and comparing the painting back and forth until we have an image that we're happy with. Well, that's pretty much all there is to photographing your own artwork. Getting the best possible images of my paintings is one of the most critical parts of my daily routine. I not only sell reproductions of my paintings, but I also license them to puzzles, also greeting cards, and various other products. And when it comes to the business of licensing your art, it's very, very important that you have clean, crisp, clear, and very large, high-resolution photographs of your artwork. So it's very important for numerous reasons and numerous aspects when it comes to the business of a professional artist. So I hope you guys were able to take away something from this and apply it to your own process. Thank you again so much for watching. Be sure to ask any questions you have. Leave them in the comments below. I'll be sure to answer them and join the discussion. Please be sure to check out my free print giveaway as well as my eBay auctions and website. Both of those links are in the description below. Again, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, we'll see you on another episode of Paint Like a Pro.